The ballroom lights glowed like captured stars, spilling golden shimmer across the polished floor. The chandeliers above swayed ever so slightly with the weight of their crystals, casting fractured halos that made the place feel like it was breathing in rhythm with the music. It was a room built to impress, designed for people who were never told no in their lives. Every wall was draped with velvet curtains, every corner decorated with flowers so fresh they still carried dew. Servants moved like shadows along the edges, unseen yet indispensable, carrying trays of champagne and canapes for guests who barely noticed them. It was a night meant to be remembered, at least by those invited to the wealthy family's annual celebration. The night air outside was damp and heavy, carrying the smell of rain-soaked roses from the mansion's garden. But inside the ballroom, the perfume of wealth and power lingered thicker than any flower could manage. The laughter of high society carried through the air like a performance, rehearsed and carefully performed for others, just as rich, just as entitled. Behind every laugh there was calculation: who stood with whom, who got noticed, and who got ignored. At the center of it all was a man who owned more than he ever needed. A millionaire whose name carried weight across town, someone who could bend people's futures with a word. He lived with the ease of someone who believed the world existed to serve him. His family wore the same air of superiority, their smiles tight, their eyes sharp. But beneath their golden surface, cracks were waiting. People whispered about their arrogance, their cruelty when no one important was watching. Still, the money drowned out most whispers. Among the guests, one stood apart. She didn't belong, not in her uniform, and certainly not on that dance floor. A maid in pressed black and white, she moved with quiet efficiency, head bowed just enough to avoid the sting of a sharp word. She carried the burden of being invisible, but her invisibility wasn't because of clumsiness or meekness. It was forced on her by the same system that gave others the right to smile in gold, while she kept her hands raw from work. To them, she was a shadow with a tray, a presence without a voice. What none of them knew, or perhaps didn't care to know, was that this woman carried something they could never buy. Her body held memory like music, the kind of memory that didn't live in the mind but in the blood, in the rhythm of her steps. Long before she wore the black and white uniform of servitude, her world had been filled with music, competitions, the heat of stage lights, and the roar of applause. She had been a champion once. Not here, not in this city where her past was just another story swallowed by survival, but elsewhere, where people rose to their feet to watch her dance. Now she walked unnoticed, her grace hidden in plain sight. She bent under trays and orders, living a life smaller than she once imagined. But sometimes, when she passed through the ballroom while the orchestra played, her hand twitched with forgotten rhythm, her feet itched with the pull of old steps. The music still spoke to her, whispering of who she had been before life pushed her into silence. The millionaire's son stood nearby, a man raised in wealth but still restless with the hunger to prove himself. Tall, well-groomed, and trained in everything expected of him, he was the kind of young man mothers hoped their daughters would marry. Yet behind the polish, his pride was fragile, fed more by expectation than true confidence. He longed for something: admiration, love, maybe even rebellion, but it was always filtered through his father's shadow. Tonight, he had been commanded to dance, to show himself as the heir, as someone worthy of attention. The orchestra swelled, violins rising like a tide. The floor cleared, and couples stepped into the light, the waltz calling them into its circle. The millionaire's voice carried above the chatter, smooth but sharp, a voice that didn't request. It declared. His words were heavy with pride as he gestured toward his son, but then, with that same show, artness, his gaze shifted. It landed on the maid as if she were no longer invisible. A mocking smile pulled at his lips as he threw down a challenge not meant to be taken seriously. "If you dance this waltz," he said loud enough for many to hear, "you marry my son." Laughter broke around the room, cruel, sharp, ringing like glass breaking. The guests chuckled into their champagne. The orchestra faltered for only a moment before pushing on. No one expected her to answer. It wasn't meant to be answered. It was humiliation dressed as humor, a reminder of where she stood. The words were supposed to shame her into silence, to make her smaller than she already was, but silence doesn't always stay where it is put. The maid's hands trembled around the silver tray, her knuckles whitening against its edge. She kept her head low, but inside, something old stirred, something stronger than shame. She remembered the heat of stage lights, the way rhythm once carried her above everything else. The music in the ballroom wasn't just background. It was a calling, a voice pulling at her bones, daring her to step forward. The challenge had been meant as a joke, but it planted a seed that would not stay buried. In the corners of that glittering room, tension coiled like smoke. Wealth has a way of turning cruelty into entertainment, but not every cruel word fades into laughter. Some stick, some grow, some tear at the fragile lines between power and the people they believe they own. The millionaire had thrown his words carelessly, but words can build walls, and they can set fire to them too. No one yet knew it, but this night, under the golden chandeliers and polished smiles, was the beginning of something that could not be undone. The music carried on, and the ballroom spun in time, but the ground beneath them was already cracking. The laughter that filled the air was about to turn into something darker. The waltz began as it always did, smooth and polished, violins weaving through the room like silk. But under that music, there was a new rhythm, one no one could ignore. The challenge thrown by the millionaire, careless, cruel, meant only to amuse, did not vanish in laughter as easily as he expected. His words clung to the air, lingering in glances, whispered behind jeweled hands, passed from guest to guest like a glass too fragile to hold. The maid, though she kept her eyes lowered and her hands steady, felt the weight of every stare. She had been marked, not as a woman, not even as a servant, but as a target. The millionaire's son shifted uncomfort. Tably, his smile tight and rehearsed, but his ears burned. He could feel the room mocking not only the maid but him as well, as if his worth had been lowered by the idea of her. The son had always lived under the shadow of his father's expectations. Perfect posture, perfect manners, perfect air. Yet here he was, humiliated without moving a muscle, his future reduced to a punchline. He glanced at the maid, searching her face for shame, but her expression remained unreadable. Something in her silence unsettled him more than if she had cried or begged. The father, meanwhile, basked in the laughter. To him, cruelty was a show of power. He loved seeing others squirm, loved pressing down on people until they broke. But power is addictive, and every audience needs a bigger performance. He didn't know yet that in reaching for another laugh, he had set the stage for something he could not control. In the days after the party, the story spread through whispers. Servants in the kitchen retold it in half-shocked, half-amused voices. Guests who had been there replayed it for friends who hadn't. The maid's name came up again and again, attached to the challenge she hadn't answered. It became less of a joke and more of a rumor, the kind that spreads like smoke, staining everything it touches. And with every retelling, her silence seemed louder. The maid herself carried the words with her like a burn. At night, when she finally lay down after long hours of scrubbing and polishing, the memory of the music haunted her. She remembered how her body had longed to move, how she almost stepped forward. Her heart beat faster when she thought of it. But along with the longing came anger. They had mocked her not for who she was, but for what she represented to them. an outsider, a servant, a shadow. To them, the idea of her dancing with their son was unthinkable, a scandal. That anger, once quiet, began to sharpen inside her. The son felt it too, but from another angle. The challenge gnawed at him, not because he cared for the maid, but because of what it revealed about his place in the world. To the guests, his father's words meant that marrying a maid was beneath him, shameful. Yet beneath their laughter was something else, an assumption that he would always do as he was told, that he would never choose his own path. He began to resent not the maid herself, but the control his father had over every part of his life. And yet, when his eyes lingered on her during the quiet moments of the day, there was something strange there. Curiosity, unease, and a pull he couldn't quite explain. The father, in his arrogance, decided to push further. A week after the party, he ordered the orchestra back for a smaller gathering. This time his words were sharper, his tone more commanding. He called the maid forward, forcing her into the circle of light where guests waited with expectant eyes. The room crackled with anticipation, hungry for another show. "Dance," he said. Just that one word, spoken like a command to a servant, not an invitation to an artist. Her hands shook, her breath caught, but the music filled her ears and something inside her snapped. She stepped onto the floor. Gasps rippled through the crowd, laughter bursting at the edges. But then the music carried her. She moved not like a maid, but like someone who had lived her life in rhythm. Every step, every turn, every movement spoke of years of training, of passion that could not be silenced. The room, once full of cruel laughter, fell quiet. The millionaire's smirk faltered, his son's jaw tightened, and the guests who had mocked now stared with something close to awe. It should have ended there, a moment of triumph reclaimed. But triumph in the wrong place is dangerous. The father's pride was wounded. What had been meant as mockery had turned into admiration. But not for him, not for his family. It had turned toward the one person he wanted to keep beneath his heel. His anger simmered, hidden under a thin smile, but his mind already spun with ways to remind her of her place. The son's emotions were messier. Watching her dance ignited something inside him, something both admiration and envy. She had moved with freedom he had never known, with a grace that didn't come from wealth or lessons, but from something deeper. He found himself drawn to her in a way that unsettled him, in a way that made him feel both alive and ashamed. He tried to bury it, but desire has a way of finding cracks. From that night on, the air in the mansion shifted. The servants noticed it first. Whispers in the halls, stolen glances, sudden outbursts from the master when he felt control slipping. The maid, once invisible, was now the center of a storm she had never asked for. The father treated her with colder cruelty, assigning her harsher tasks, punishing her for the smallest mistakes. The son, meanwhile, lingered near her, speaking when he could, searching for ways to understand the pull he felt. Their conversations were brief, cautious, but each word carried weight. The tension grew outside the mansion as well. The wealthy family's circle of friends gossiped endlessly about the maid's dance. Some mocked, others marveled, but all agreed it was a scandal. For the father, it was humiliation he couldn't tolerate. He had built his world on respect and power, and now both were threatened by a single servant daring to outshine him in his own house. The maid felt the pressure pressing in from all sides. The stares, the whispers, the punishments. They carved at her. But they also fueled something she had long buried. Pride. She began to hold her head higher, her steps firmer, even under the weight of cruelty. She had been reminded of who she once was, and no amount of punishment could erase it. And yet, danger grew with every step she took toward her old self. The father's temper sharpened, the son's obsession deepened, and the walls of the mansion seemed to close in around her. The waltz that had once been nothing more than music had become a weapon, a reminder, and a promise all at once. The storm was building, and all of them, father, son, and maid, were trapped inside it. None of them could escape what was coming, because it was no longer about a dance. It was about power, pride, desire, and the shadows people try to hide until they can't anymore. The night of the crime was drawing, nearer, though none of them could yet name it. They only felt its presence in every sharp word, every stolen glance, every tightening thread that pulled them closer to breaking. The night of the crime carried a weight that was felt before a single word was spoken. The mansion stood like a fortress against the dark, its windows glowing gold against the storm clouds that had rolled in by evening. Rain fell in steady sheets, drumming against the glass, drowning the garden in mud and shadows. Inside, the ballroom had been prepared once again for guests, another evening of wealth on display, another excuse for the millionaire to prove his dominance over everyone around him. But beneath the glitter, tension hung heavy. Everyone in that house carried something unsaid, something festering. Tonight, it would split open. The orchestra played, though their notes were tighter, quicker, almost uneasy. Servants hurried about with trays, their faces pale from exhaustion. The guests laughed, but it was thinner than before, as though even they sensed that something was about to break. And at the center of it all was the maid. She moved through the room, balancing silver trays with steady hands, though inside, her heart raced. She could feel the eyes on her. Since the night she had danced, there was no going back. Her invisibility was gone, stripped away, leaving her exposed. The weight of the challenge still burned on her, but it had twisted into something else. The whispers that followed her in the halls, the punishments that fell harder, the son's watchful gaze, all of it had been building to this night. The millionaire stood near the grand staircase, a glass of wine in his hand, his voice cutting above the chatter. He was restless, prowling like a man who needed a performance to keep the world under his control. He looked at his son, then at the maid, and a cruel thought bloomed. Once again, he would turn his power into spectacle. "Another waltz," he declared to the room, his smile too sharp, his voice edged with venom. "And this time, let's see if our little maid dares again." The room stilled. Guests exchanged glances, half amused, half horrified. The son's face flushed red, his chest rising and falling too quickly. He wanted to protest, but the weight of his father's authority silenced him. The maid froze, her hands trembling against the tray. The orchestra hesitated, bows hovering, waiting for the command. The music began, soft at first, then rising. And she moved. Not because she wanted to, but because something inside her refused to let them break her again. She stepped into the center of the floor, her black and white uniform clashing with the silks and jewels surrounding her. Every step was defiance, every turn a rejection of the role they forced on her. The room held its breath as she spun, the rhythm carrying her higher than their laughter could reach. But the millionaire's face twisted with rage. This was not the humiliation he wanted. This was admiration again, respect given to someone he believed unworthy. His power was slipping, and in his world, power was everything. His son's eyes were fixed on her too, not with pity, but with something far more dangerous. Desire. And that was the moment when everything tipped. The dance ended. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the sound of rain pounding the glass. The maid stood breathless, her chest rising and falling, her eyes locked on the floor. Then came the sound that split the silence, the slow, mocking clap of the millionaire. His smile was poison. "You forget your place," he said, stepping forward. His voice was low, but it carried like thunder. "You think you're more than a servant because you can move your feet. You are nothing. Nothing." The son moved then, his voice shaking but loud enough to be heard. "Father, stop." It was the first time he had spoken against him in public. The room turned, shock flashing across faces. The millionaire's eyes snapped to his son, blazing with fury, and then chaos. The father's hand shot out, not toward his son, but toward the maid. He grabbed her arm hard, yanking her forward, his voice rising into a shout. "You will never shame me again." The guests gasped, chairs scraping as people stood, uncertain, frozen between fear and fascination. The son lunged forward, trying to pull his father back. The struggle was messy, desperate, wine spilling, glass shattering, the orchestra falling silent in panic. The millionaire shoved his son aside, his grip on the maid tightening, his face red with rage. The maid cried out, the sound raw and sharp, breaking through the shocked silence of the room. And then it happened. A sudden, violent moment that no one could take back. The struggle between father and son erupted. The son, in a burst of anger and desperation, shoved his father harder than he meant to. The millionaire staggered, his hand still clutching the maid's arm, pulling her with him. His foot slipped on the polished floor, slick with spilled wine. For one suspended heartbeat, the entire room seemed to hold still. And then he fell. The sound of his skull striking the marble floor was sickening, final. A crack that silenced the world. The maid stumbled free, falling to her knees, her hands shaking. The son froze, his breath caught in his throat, staring down at the crumpled figure of the man who had ruled every corner of his life. The guests screamed, some rushing forward, others backing away as if the very air had turned to fire. The millionaire lay motionless, blood pooling beneath his head, spreading across the white marble like ink soaking into paper. His eyes were open but empty, his mouth twisted in the echo of rage that would never fade. The room erupted in chaos. Shouts, gasps, the clatter of heels against the floor. The orchestra had abandoned their instruments, the servants huddled against the walls, and the guests argued in frantic whispers. What had they just witnessed? Who was to blame? The son dropped to his knees beside the body, his hands hovering over the blood but never touching. His face was pale, his breath shallow. "I didn't mean," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean." But even he didn't know who he was speaking to. The maid, the crowd, or the ghost of the man whose shadow he could never escape. The maid stood trembling, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it would break through her chest. She looked at the blood, at the lifeless eyes, at the son who now stared at her as if she held the answer to what had just happened. But there was no answer. Only the truth was that none of them could undo what had been done. Panic rippled through the room. Some guests wanted to call the police immediately. Others urged silence, covering it up, protecting the family's name. The servants stood frozen, torn between fear of their master and fear of the law. And at the center of it all was the son, drenched in guilt and shock, his hands shaking as he stared at the blood, spreading wider and wider. The maid felt every eye on her again, not mocking this time, but piercing, judging. She had been at the center of the storm from the start, but now she was tethered to the crime itself. She had not lifted a hand against the millionaire, yet she knew, deep inside, that without her, this night might have ended differently. The thought burned her with equal parts shame and defiance. The bee. Odie lay there, unmovable, the room trapped in the echo of the fall, and in that moment the fragile order of their world shattered. Wealth, power, obedience, none of it mattered now. There was only blood on the marble, a dead man, and the beginning of a nightmare none of them could control. The ballroom never felt the same again. The music had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was louder than any orchestra. The body of the millionaire was gone by dawn, carried out beneath a white sheet, but the stain of blood on the marble refused to disappear. Servants scrubbed until their hands were raw, yet the memory of red clung to the stone. Even after the floor gleamed spotless, the people who walked across it swore they still saw shadows of what had happened there. The guests who had witnessed the fall scattered back into their worlds, but they did not leave quietly. The whispers spread faster than wildfire. Some told it as an accident, others as a disgrace, some even shaping it into a scandalous story of lust and defiance. But all agreed on one thing: the night had destroyed the family's name. A man who once commanded respect now became a cautionary tale, his arrogance remembered in the worst way possible. The wealth that had shielded him for years could not protect his memory from the judgment of gossip. Inside the mansion, the sun spiraled. He replayed the moment again and again, every detail sharper with each passing hour. The shove, the slip, the sound of his father's skull cracking against marble. His hands trembled when he looked at them, as if the blood had soaked into his skin, even though he never touched it. He could not escape the thought: was it really an accident? Or had I wanted it? That question poisoned him. For years he had lived under the weight of his father's control, humiliated, mocked, suffocated. In that instant of pushing back, he had felt something he had never felt before: power. And though the horror of the fall crushed him, buried somewhere in his chest was the memory of that power. That thought haunted him even more than the death itself. The maid carried her own torment. She had not touched the millionaire in those final moments, yet she knew the tragedy would never untangle from her presence. She had been the spark, the trigger of every cruel word, every swelling wave of pride and rage. The whispers in the kitchen grew sharper each day. Some servants pitied her, whispering that she was cursed. Others despised her, blaming her for the disaster that had taken the roof from over their heads. She avoided mirrors, for when she looked into them, she saw not herself, but the image of him falling, dragging her in his grip before the marble caught him. The community beyond the mansion walls devoured the story. Newspapers printed bold headlines about the fall of a millionaire in his own house. At first, the official report called it an accident, an unfortunate slip at a party. But rumors refused to rest. Too many guests had seen the argument, the struggle, the shove. The story twisted depending on who told it. Some painted the son as a grieving child caught in a nightmare, while others whispered he had finally snapped after years of living under a tire. Some even dragged the maid into their tales, painting her as a temptress who had bewitched both father and son, destroying the family from the inside. For the family's surviving relatives, the weight was unbearable. Business partners pulled away quietly, fearful of scandal clinging to their names. Friends stopped visiting, pretending their absence was grief when it was really shame. The mansion, once a place of endless gatherings, grew colder, quieter, its halls echoing with memories no one wanted to face. The son, now the heir, sat in his father's office for hours at a time, staring at the desk where deals had been made and lives had been decided. The leather chair creaked under his weight, but it never felt like his. He would run his fingers over the polished wood, imagining his father's hand slamming against it, commanding silence. Now he was the one in power, but instead of pride, he felt only a hollow echo. The very thing he had longed for his entire life, freedom from his father's shadow, had come in blood. The maid considered leaving, but where could she go? The scandal followed her like a shadow. If she left, she would always be remembered as the servant who danced when she should not have. The servant at the center of the night, a millionaire, died. If she stayed, she risked drowning in the whispers, punished daily by the very walls of the house. Still, she stayed, not out of loyalty, but because something tied her there, something she could not name. Perhaps guilt, perhaps defiance. The servants avoided her, their conversations ending when she entered the room. Guests who returned for business spoke of her in lowered voices, eyes sliding over her as if she were both invisible and infamous at once. She could not breathe without feeling the weight of judgment pressing down. Yet in the quiet hours, when she walked past the empty ballroom, she sometimes paused, her body aching to move, to dance. The music lived in her still, but now it was bound to tragedy. The law eventually came. The police interviewed every witness, every servant. Their questions were sharp, their eyes sharper. The official story held to accident, but the detectives saw cracks. They pressed the son hardest, demanding details of his father's final moments. His answers wavered, his voice breaking under the pressure. Guilt bled into every word, making him sound more guilty even when he tried to hold his ground. The maid, too, was questioned, her every move dissected. She repeated the truth again and again. He slipped. She never touched him. Still, she could feel the doubt in their eyes. The case never became a trial. The family's influence, though shaken, still reached far enough to close doors before they opened. But the stain of suspicion lingered. The public never fully believed the accident story. Whispers carried further than truth, and in the streets, the tale became larger than life. Some painted the son as a murderer, others painted the maid as a siren of destruction. In reality, both carried nothing but grief. The emotional toll deepened with time. The son grew thinner, paler, as if the life had been drained out of him along with his father's. Nights brought no rest, only nightmares of marble floors and broken skulls. He withdrew into himself, speaking little, haunted by his own reflection. The maid hardened in silence. The sorrow carved her, but it also lit a fire. She refused to bow her head any more. Each cruel stare she met with steady eyes, each whisper with silence that cut deeper than words. But inside she was tired. So tired she sometimes wondered if the dance had been worth it. The mansion itself decayed with them. Chandeliers dulled, curtains grew heavy with dust, and the garden withered from neglect. The laughter that once filled its rooms had been replaced by emptiness. And beyond the gates, the world moved on, leaving only the legend. And of the night, the wealthy destroyed themselves from within. What had once been a story of pride and power became a story of downfall. And though the father was gone, his shadow stretched longer than ever, binding the living to the crime that had set them free and imprisoned them all at once. The mansion that had once stood as a symbol of wealth, dominance, and untouchable power became, in the years that followed, a ruin in more ways than one. The marble was polished, the chandeliers repaired, the gardens trimmed back into shape, but no amount of restoration could cleanse what lingered in its walls. To outsiders, it became a place people pointed at in whispers. The house where a man of immense fortune died not in glory, but in blood and disgrace. Inside, those who remained were bound to that night like prisoners, unable to escape the shadow of what had happened. The son, who had inherited everything his father once owned, found himself more trapped than liberated. The estate, the businesses, the money, all of it was his now, but each coin carried the weight of death. He spent sleepless nights staring at his father's portrait, wondering if justice had been served or if he had simply inherited guilt in place of freedom. He knew the push had been desperate, not planned, but that did not silence the voice inside him that whispered he had wanted his father gone. That whisper grew louder with every year, hollowing him out. The law had spared him. The system had closed its eyes. But true justice, the kind that lived inside the conscience, had not. He wore his new title like a chain, not a crown. The maid's life, too, was forever marked. She remained in service for a time, though her presence in the mansion became unbearable for those who lived and worked there. To some, she was the face of tragedy. To others, the curse that had destroyed their master. Every step she took through the halls was shadowed by whispers. Every glance she met carried suspicion or pity. Eventually she left, disappearing from the mansion without farewell. Some claim she returned to dancing in quiet corners of the city, reclaiming the art that had been stolen from her. Others believed she drifted into obscurity, burdened by guilt she could never name. What was certain was that she carried with her the knowledge that one act of defiance had changed not only her life, but the lives of everyone around her. The community's memory of the crime lived on much longer than the legal files. The newspapers had written their stories, the rumors had done their damage, and the tale became almost folklore. For the wealthy it was told as a cautionary story, about arrogance, about scandal, about letting those beneath them rise too high. For the poor, it was remembered differently, as a story of injustice, of how power silences truth, of how the law bends for the rich, while the rest are left with blame and suspicion. Both versions lived on, shaping how people spoke about the family, the maid, and the night the waltz ended in blood. Was justice ever served? Legally, yes. The verdict of accident was never overturned, the case never reopened. But in the hearts of those who had been there, the truth remained far more complicated. Some believed the son guilty of patricide, even if unintentional. Some blamed the maid, twisting her dance into an act of provocation. Others held the father responsible for his own death, a man consumed by pride who created the very storm that killed him. The truth tangled as eye. T offered no comfort. Justice in this story was not delivered by courts or police. It was carried by memory, by scars that refused to fade. The crime revealed more than just the downfall of one family. It cracked open the very structure of power that had defined their world. For years, the millionaire had treated people as objects, pawns in a game he always believed he controlled. But the night of his death showed the fragility of that control. His arrogance turned into humiliation, his pride into destruction. In the end, the man who commanded a room with his presence died not surrounded by admiration, but by fear, pity, and whispers. His fall was not just physical, it was symbolic, a reminder that power, no matter how vast, is never absolute. For the son, the tragedy forced him into adulthood in the harshest way possible. He learned that freedom won through violence carries a price too heavy to bear. His life became a lesson in how resentment, unspoken for too long, can erupt in ways no one expects. For the maid, it was proof that dignity could not be mocked away, that even in humiliation, a person can hold on to who they are. Yet it was also a warning. In a world built on inequality, standing tall can come with unbearable costs. The broader society found in this story a mirror of its own contradictions. Wealth and privilege had shielded the family from accountability, yet they could not shield them from ruin. The public's obsession with the scandal revealed their hunger to see the mighty fall, but also their willingness to twist truth into whatever story entertained them most. It highlighted how easily blame falls on those with the least power, how society punishes the vulnerable even when they are victims of cruelty. In the end, the waltz was more than a dance. It became a symbol of power, of defiance, of tragedy. It revealed the fragility of control, the dangers of pride, and the weight of silence. One careless challenge, spoken for amusement, unraveled an entire family, destroyed reputations, and left lives scarred forever. The music had ended long ago, but its echo remained in the choices each of them made and in the consequences that rippled far beyond that single night. Stories like these remind us that crime is rarely born from a single act. It is the result of pressures building, of pride colliding with pain, of silence festering until it explodes. Justice, morality, power, they are not clean, not simple. They are tangled in human flaws, in desires we cannot control, in the choices we make when pushed too far. The millionaire's name faded with time, spoken now only in whispers of warning. The son lived under the shadow of guilt, carrying a crown made of shame. The maid carried both defiance and sorrow, her dance remembered not for beauty, but for the tragedy it sparked. And society, as always, moved on. leaving behind the broken lives while keeping the story alive in rumor. The ballroom stands silent now, its chandeliers cold, its marble floor polished smooth. Yet for those who know the story, stepping into that room feels like stepping onto a stage where ghosts still move. You can almost hear the violins rise, almost see a figure step forward in defiance, almost hear the echo of a fall that changed everything. And in that silence lies the truth. Power corrupts, pride destroys, but memory never lets go.